Hey everyone, welcome to the Tortured Poets Department. Today we're going to talk a little bit about all things poetry. So let's get into it. So first, what is poetry? Poetry is a form of literary expression that uses rhythmic and aesthetic qualities of language to evoke feeling and a sense of meaning. Feelings and emotions are a big part of poetry. It's supposed to draw things out of you, like the human expression. So that's a big part of it, the way that we use language to evoke these things and a sense of meaning. Poetry is also a work of resonant, sensual language that provides a unique experience while it makes a unique observation about life. So sensual doesn't necessarily mean sexual. Like there are definitely some poems that are sexual in nature, but sensual more so means like, what's a good way to explain this? It's more so really just like involving the gratification of your senses in general. So again, sometimes that's sexual, but it's a work that uses language that draws on your senses, that provides a unique experience while it makes a unique observation about life. So a unique experience essentially means that poetry affects people differently. I might read a poem very differently than you might read a poem. That's not to say either one of us is right or wrong. That just means that we have a unique experience with the poem that others may not be able to have, and that's one of the really beautiful things about poetry. So moving a little bit more into the beauty of poetry, the power of poetry. I love this quote from Ed Hirsch. It says, "Poems communicate before they are understood, and the structure operates on or inside the reader, even as the words infiltrate the consciousness." So there's this idea that poems are able to move us and affect us like on the inside before we're necessarily able to actually comprehend what it means. This has happened to me so many times where I'm reading a poem and I am just suddenly so moved by it, but I'm not sure why. And the more times I go back and I read the poem, I start to understand why. But that's a powerful thing, right? To be able to affect someone, to make someone feel a certain way before even really knowing why. This happens with music too, a lot. Like you could hear music like without lyrics and suddenly just be so overcome with emotion and not really understand why. Poetry has the same power. We might not get it right away, but it makes us feel some type of way. So continuing with the power of poetry, emotional expression, right? It allows writers to express complex emotions and thoughts. So that's for the writer. And also for the reader, provides a cathartic experience, helping individuals process their feelings. Poetry is kind of like therapy. A lot of people say that, where you'll read something and it'll resonate so deeply with you that it's so cathartic and relieving to you. And that's very powerful, emotional expression. It also has cultural and historical significance, right? Poetry reflects culture, traditions, and values of a society, preserving them for future generations. So if you pick up a sonnet from Shakespeare, you're able to understand a little bit about the culture of that time, the traditions, the values of the society during the time in which Shakespeare was writing. It preserves history for us, and that's something that's really cool. Like if you, obviously we can get history from picking up a history book, right? But not everyone wants to read a history book. So you can get this same sense of like understanding history and culture from a different time by reading a piece of poetry. Additionally, it provides insights into the historical context into which they were written, offering perspectives on past events and societal norms. So essentially exactly what I said, just saying in a different way. It gives us an insight to culture and history of the time. Moving on to language and creativity. Poetry improves vocabulary, comprehension, and appreciation for the nuances of language. So reading poetry makes you a smarter person. Like that's just straight up how it is. It improves your vocabulary, it helps you understand things better, and it helps you appreciate how complex language is. You'll notice when we start reading poetry that using language is an art. Like it's like painting, kind of, right? Like using words to illustrate a bigger concept, to paint a picture, essentially. And so when we really understand how to read poetry, we're able to appreciate language in general. Poetry also encourages creative thinking and the use of imaginative language, allowing for a unique and personal expression. Intellectual stimulation, so going back into like poetry makes you smarter. It promotes critical thinking and interpretation, engaging the mind in a deep and meaningful way. Poetry makes you think. Of course, there are poems where you read it the first time and you understand what it's saying, but really good, deep poetry, it calls for some deep thinking, and that is so good for the brain. This is a critical thinking class, right? And so we want to exercise or get better at being able to think critically, and reading poetry will definitely expand those skills that we already have. Poetry explores philosophical and existential questions, prompting readers to reflect on their own beliefs and experiences. So, existential questions like, what is the meaning of life, right? Those big philosophical questions. It sounds cliche, right? Asking like, what is the meaning of life? But when we ask those questions by reading poetry, by like interacting with art like this, it really helps us reflect on our own beliefs and experiences. Like, how do my own experiences create what I define as like the meaning of life, right? Or how does this poem challenge what I define the meaning of life to be, right? It really makes us think deeply, ask questions, think critically, all which are good for us. Connection and communication. Poetry explores these big ideas, these universal themes like love, loss, nature, identity, reflection, like these big concepts that all of us at some point in our life experience in one way or another. And so there's this like uniting factor of poetry. Like we may be living very different lives from our neighbor, but we all still experience these universal themes in one way. And so that poetry kind of acts as a bridge in some senses, where it can connect people from different cultures, times, like different everything, different ways of life. It can connect us in a certain way. Even if we have different interpretations, the fact that we as like humanity are connected by these like bigger concepts or these universal themes is such a cool thing to explore. And poetry is one of the easiest ways to explore these things. Poetry can resonate with us at a personal level. Like we all have our own interpretations, but the fact that we all of our interpretations can be connected in some way is really beautiful and really connecting. Aesthetic pleasure. Poetry is just fun to read. And that's not to say every poem. Like, if you say that you like to read poetry, that doesn't mean that you enjoy every single poem you read. Like, that's not the case. But poem has this rhythmic and musical quality that provides some kind of aesthetic pleasure, that like it's enjoyable to read, it's enjoyable to listen to, right? It's an art form that uses words, it uses sound, it uses sometimes visual elements depending on what kind of poetry you're reading, and it creates this multifaceted experience for us as readers to experience and us as writers to experience if we partake in any kind of poetry writing. I hate poetry. So if you are thinking this when you are watching this lecture, you are certainly not alone, I promise you. There is or has been a historical dislike of poetry and hesitancy towards like embracing poetry from students. And let me say this, like I understand that, and I am an English major. I love all things English. But when I was a student, poetry was like my least favorite thing. Every time an English class was like, okay, we're doing poetry, I was like, oh my gosh, no. So you are not alone. Even people like me who like embrace the arts and teach English for their job, like there is this like struggle to really embrace it. And that kind of happens for a multitude of reasons. One, a lack of relevancy. A lot of times it's easy to feel like, okay, how does this poem relate to me in any way, shape, or form? Like, okay, I don't want to read Shakespeare. Shakespeare's like the big one, right? People are like, oh, it's so old, it's so old. one, poetry is more than Shakespeare. Like, poetry is written all the time. Like, that is old. And so I know it's easy to feel like it's not relevant. That's another reason why in this unit we are going to be talking about music, like music lyrics of a song. And hopefully that feels more relevant to you than maybe some other poetry that people have assigned to you in the past. But that is a big reason why people are so hesitant to like embrace poetry, or they don't like to read it, is because they feel like it's not relevant to their lives overall. Perceived difficulty. There is this like conception that reading poetry is extremely hard, and that in turn makes people feel stupid. Like when you are sitting reading a poem, and like maybe you've had the experience of sitting in class and you read the poem and it doesn't really mean anything to you, you don't understand it, and then everyone else around you is like, seems to really embrace it and understand it and have these deep, like heavy interpretations, that can make you not feel so good. And that is completely understandable. However, I am here to tell you that, poetry is relevant. Okay. Like, poetry is and always will be relevant if we're able to understand it. Can reading poetry be hard? Yes, but you can figure it out. And 3, you are not stupid. Like, the poem isn't the problem. You as the reader is not the problem. The problem is most people don't know how to read poetry. They don't know how to read a poem. And that is so extremely important. So that's what we're going to talk about now. How do we actually read a poem? Like, what are the steps? Let's go ahead and start walking through it. So step 1, read the poem out loud, okay? Poems are like music. There is a musicality to it. There is a rhythm and like this overall like sense of sound, and like that really contributes to the poem overall. So it's really important to read it out loud to get a sense of the rhythm, the sound, the overall feel. Pay attention to how the words flow and the emotions they evoke. The way the words sound can trigger some kind of emotion. So that's important, an important aspect of why you should read the poem out loud. Poetry often relies on different sound devices like alliteration, assonance, consonance, and rhyme. In this unit, so in this week's module, I have posted a list of poetic devices, so a list of poetic terms that you need to know. It's important for you to know how these devices are used, because you are going to incorporate these devices into your poetry presentation, into your poetry essay, and you're going to talk about these devices when we analyze these poems and songs in class. So please, please, please take a look at that poetry list, get to know it, so you are able to recognize these different sound devices that come up when you read the poem out loud. When we hear these elements, it can enhance our understanding of like the poem's musicality, the rhythm, how it contributes to the overall effect. Let me give you an example of alliteration. So alliteration is when there is like back-to-back-to-back words that start with the same consonant. So Peter Piper picked a pail of peppers, whatever that phrase is, right? So they all start with the P sound. There is a power behind that, the p. And so reading it out loud matters. There's this like a rhythm to it that adds to the overall effect. Think of like when you're listening to music and there's like a consistent drum beat in the back. Like that adds like, there is like an overall effect to a tempo, to a beat. So it's important for us to be able to hear that out loud. So step 1, read the poem out loud. Do not skip this step. I know it's easy to say, oh, I'm just going to read it in my head. That's fine. No, read the poem out loud. Step 1, start there before you do anything else. Step 2, reread the poem multiple times, okay? When you read a poem the first time, this is for you to just get like a general sense of the poem overall, like what is happening, okay? After that, every time you read, you're going to go back and notice like details that maybe you had initially missed, okay? When we read something more than once, it creates an appreciation of the poet's choice of words and how the words contribute to the overall effect. When we read it once, we're not really able to like study the detail or study like the beauty or like the art of language that the poet used. And so it's important for us to look at these things when we go back and read multiple times. When we do this, we can identify and understand the use of literary devices, the use of those poetic devices that I have listed for you that you're going to go and look at, right? It's probably more common than not when we read a poem the first time through, we're not going to notice alliteration. We're not going to notice a specific rhyme scheme. Tons of different things, right? So we have to go back. And when we do that, we're able to identify and understand these different devices that are being used to add to the overall meaning of the poem. Step 3, understand the literal meaning. Okay, so we read this, we've read it a couple times. What does this poem mean? Okay, like what is the literal meaning of the words and sentences? Like, so when we read like fiction prose, like a short story or a novel, this is us asking ourselves, okay, like what is the plot? Like what is just like actually what's happening in the poem, not what's happening underneath, like not like the underlying message, but you want to understand just like the literal meaning of what's happening in a poem, okay? What's happening? What is the setting? Where is it at? Setting is super important. So like a poem that takes place in the trenches of World War II versus on top of the Eiffel Tower in 2025, like those settings are obviously completely different. And so the tone and the overall meaning of the poems are probably going to be pretty different. So where is the setting? Where are the events of this poem happening? And what does the title reveal? A title is significant always, no matter what type of literature you're reading, whether it's a short story, a novel, a poem. The title is always so important, and people kind of read it once and they skip over it and never come back to it. But the title is the title for a reason. Like that was chosen really intentionally. So it's important to ask ourselves, what does the title of this piece add, or what does it reveal to me about like the literal meaning of this poem? Step 4, identify the speaker and audience. So who is speaking in the poem? Is it actually the poet who is just speaking to you? Is it like a fictional, like a persona, right? Is it a specific character that this poet has created? When poems are written in first person, that's like I, me, we, our, right? Speaking from the inside because they're directly involved in the action. So that's a first person speaker. That's something you want to know, right? If I ask you, okay, who is the speaker here? You should know whether or not it's written in first person or third person, right? Third person speakers are the outside observers. He did this. Jonathan said this, blah, 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 blah. Taking the self out of the poem, okay? And the self not being you as the reader, the self being the speaker. Is the speaker inside the poem, like speaking for themselves, or is the speaker like speaking on behalf of somebody else, essentially? It's also really important to determine who the speaker is addressing. Like, is the speaker of the poem, like talking to a specific person? Like, is it their lover? Is it their wife? Is it their dead child? Who are they talking to? Is it a specific group of people? Or is it just you as the reader in general, right? So you have to know who the speaker is and who the audience is, basically. The speaker is essentially the narrator. We use the term narrator in like movies, if there's a voiceover, or in a short story that's written in like maybe third person, we say, oh, the narrator said this, the person who is telling the story. We don't necessarily use narrator when we're talking about poetry. We use the term speaker. So know who the speaker is, know who the audience is. Step 5, analyze the structure. So what is the poem's form? Form is essentially what the structure is, right? So there are different types of poems that have like certain qualifications to meet if they are to be considered that specific poem. So is this a sonnet? Is it a haiku? Is it free verse? Is this a visual poem? Determine what the poem's forms are. The ones that I want you to know, they are listed on the poetic device terms. Not all of them, but you should know, okay, what is the poem's form? You also then want to analyze stanzas and lines. So stanzas are essentially paragraphs. Lines are like the equivalent of a sentence. So a stanza is like a chunk of different lines, and then the lines are like the individual sentences or the individual lines that create the stanza, okay? Ask yourself, how is the poem divided? Like, Are there stanzas that are 6 lines long and then a stanza that is 2 lines long? How does the structure contribute to the poem's meaning? Okay, so structure. There's a poem called The Christmas Tree. I'm going to show you this right now. And if you'll notice the structure, it looks like a Christmas tree. Like that's something you should take note of. Okay, so if you were analyzing this, you would note that this is some kind of visual poetry, that like the shape of the poem, the shape that the poem takes, like adds to the meaning of the poem overall. So again, analyze the structure, determine the poem's form, and then how are the different lines being used? Step 6, look for poetic devices. So again, going back to those list of terms that are in this week's module, at this point, we want to start looking for those things. Are there any similes hidden in here? Are there any metaphors, metonyms, motifs? All of these things. These poetic devices are incorporated by the poet to add complexity and richness to the text. We talked about in a previous lecture how authors leave like little clues for us in their writing, for us to kind of like act as a detective to find these little clues and add them together to create or to find the meaning of the overall piece. That's the same thing here, right? It's up to us to look for the poetic devices that the poet has incorporated in their piece to figure out the poet's message more fully, okay? When we are able to understand these poetic devices, it allows us to appreciate the skill and creativity of the poet and the poem as a work of art. Poems are not easy to create. Surprise, surprise. If you've ever written a poem, like it's obviously harder for others than it is, it just depends. But I don't think anyone would say, oh, creating a poem is easy. Like it's a work of art. Like it takes effort. There is skill and like creativity being infused into this work of art by the poet. And so when we're able to really like analyze it and find these different poetic devices, we can really appreciate the work that the author is doing here, that the poet is doing, okay? When we understand these poetic devices, we can kind of figure out what the theme is of the poem, right? Like what are the ideas being discussed here? You know what a theme is. And so again, it's like a recipe. We're adding up all of these different pieces and figuring out like what comes out in the end. Like when we combine all of these different poetic devices and the meanings behind these poetic devices, when we add them together, we get our interpretation out of it, okay? So it's really important to understand these poetic devices so we can understand like the intent behind the author actually incorporating them into the poem. All right, our next step is identify motifs and themes. So I know we talked about this in a previous lecture, but as a reminder, a motif is like a phrase, a word, whereas a theme is a complete sentence. We want to identify what abstract concepts are being explored. So for example, if you are reading a poem about World War II, okay? A motif might be the ugliness of war. And then as a reminder, when we want to figure out what the themes are going from a motif, we have to ask ourselves, okay, what is the author, and in this case, the poet, what is the poet saying about the ugliness of war? What is the poet saying about this specific motif, right? This is when we want to determine the main theme or message of the poem, okay? What is the overall lesson the poet is trying to convey? So if we're moving from the motif of ugliness of war, the theme could potentially be the ugliness of war or overshadows the glory of war. So again, going from a motif to a theme is just asking yourself a question. What is the author saying about this specific motif? This is the step where we really like dive into like the underlying meaning of the poem, right? We've identified all these different devices, the speaker, the audience. We understand what the poem means at like surface level. Now we're diving deeper. We're diving into the subtext and trying to figure out like what are these abstract concepts? What are the main ideas, the main themes or messages that are being presented in this poem? Last but not least, the last step is to reflect and to write. Think about the poem that you read and how it resonates with you personally. Like, what emotions or thoughts did this evoke? What was the experience like for you reading this poem? Like, did you feel sad? Were you mad? Were you disgusted? Are you confused? Are you left like with this kind of turmoil of emotions that you don't really understand? Emotions are a huge part of reading and analyzing poetry. So how you feel is really important. So you want to make sure that you actually reflect on that after you've gone through all of these other steps. Once you have reflected on these things, you need to write it down, right? Write your thoughts, write down your analysis, write down your interpretation of the poem, right? At this point, you've gone through all of the steps and you have come out the other side with your own interpretation of the poem. Don't just like leave that up here in your head. Write it down. Summarize the poem in your own words. This will really solidify your understanding of it, like physically writing down or typing, whatever. Just documenting what you think from here onto some kind of other document. It's a memory retention device. When we write it down, we are more likely to retain what it is that we wrote down. So it's important that whenever you come out on the other side with your interpretation, with these feelings, with your analysis, that you actually document it somewhere. So that is it on our lecture of poetry. You made it to the other side. Like we talked about earlier, I really do understand this hesitancy to embrace poetry or like want to actually read and analyze it. But I promise you, if you do apply yourself and follow these steps, you will get something out of it. How you feel and like what you think about something, that is such a large part of analyzing poetry. So if you allow yourself to do that, if you allow yourself to feel, if you allow yourself to have thoughts and feelings about a piece, you can get something out of it, okay? Poetry is what you make of it. So please come into this unit with an open mind, try your best every day, and that's all we can do, right? Follow the steps, and if you are confused after following the steps and you just like really don't understand, that's okay too. We're not going to understand poems every single time, even if we follow the steps. We're just not magical human beings, right? Sometimes we don't understand, and that's okay. Bring those questions to class, the things that you don't understand, and we will talk about those together, okay? I promise you it's going to be a fun unit. We're going to talk about lots of good poems, good songs, and I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say about them.